A brindle pit bull, with a shattered leg and open wounds across her back, dragged herself through a freezing parking lot at 3 in the morning. She collapsed at the steel door of the last place anyone would look for mercy, a motorcycle club's garage. When Garrett Whitfield pried that door open, what he found beneath the bleeding animal stopped him cold. 3 newborn puppies, blind and trembling, pressed against her broken body. She hadn't crawled there to die. She'd carried them. And when 300 of the most feared bikers in Nevada learned what happened next, not a single one of them could speak. The fluorescent light above Garrett Whitfield's workbench had been flickering for 2 weeks. He kept meaning to replace it, the way he kept meaning to fix the cracked window in the upstairs bathroom, the way he kept meaning to call his sister back in Spokane. But the hours had a way of dissolving inside the garage, hands deep in engine grease, the smell of gasoline and old leather settling into his clothes like a second skin. And by the time he looked up, another day had bled into another night. At 47, Garrett carried the kind of frame that made people cross the street. 6'3", 240 pounds, forearms ribboned with tattoos that climbed from his wrists to his collarbones. His beard, threaded with grey now, hung past his chest. A scar ran through his left eyebrow from a bar fight he'd rather forget, and a youth he couldn't take back. The leather vest he wore bore the insignia of the 300 Angels Motorcycle Club, a winged skull wreathed in chain links, and on the back, stitched in white thread against black leather, his title, President. The 300 Angels had called Reno home for over 2 decades. 300 members spread across 4 chapters in Nevada and Northern California, bound together by a love of the road and a code that outsiders never bothered to understand. To the residents of the East Side neighborhood, where Garrett's garage sat at the end of Millbrook Avenue, the Angels were noise, trouble, and threat. Property values dipped when they moved in. Parents steered strollers to the opposite sidewalk. The old woman next door, Mrs. Darnell, had called the police 11 times in the past year, twice for loud music, the rest for what she described as suspicious activity, which amounted to men in leather vests grilling burgers in the parking lot. Garrett had stopped trying to change their minds years ago. He'd organized toy drives at Christmas, led highway cleanup crews every spring along I-80, raised $14,000 for the children's burn unit at Renown Medical Center. The local news covered it once, buried the segment after the weather report, and never followed up. None of it stuck. The leather and the ink and the rumble of 40 Harleys pulling into a parking lot drowned out everything else. People saw what they wanted to see, and what they wanted to see was a threat. It was a Wednesday in late October. Garrett had stayed up past 2 in the morning, rebuilding the carburetor on a 1978 Shovelhead that belonged to a club brother down in Carson City. The desert night had gone cold, the way it always did in the high basin. 70 degrees at sunset, barely 40 by midnight. He'd pulled the rolling door down to keep the warmth in, left just the side entrance cracked for air, and worked by the hum of a space heater and a country station playing low on the shop radio. He'd just finished reassembling the float bowl and was cleaning his hands with a rag soaked in mineral spirits when he heard it. A sound at the side door. Not a knock, something lower, weaker. A dragging, scraping noise against the concrete step, followed by a faint whimper that barely rose above the radio static. It came again, scratching, desperate, fading. Garrett set the rag down. He reached behind the workbench where he kept a heavy maglite, the kind that doubled as a weapon if needed, and walked toward the door. The night air hit him like a slap. He angled the beam downward and froze. A dog lay on the concrete step, or what was left of a dog. A pit bull mix, maybe 50 pounds when healthy, but now closer to 30. Every rib pressing against a coat of brindle fur, matted with dirt and dried blood. Her left hind leg bent at an angle that no leg should bend, the joint swollen and discolored. Deep lacerations crossed her shoulders and back, some fresh and weeping, others scabbed over in dark ridges that spoke of weeks of accumulated damage. Her eyes, amber and enormous in her wasted face, looked up at the light without flinching. They held no aggression, only a vast, exhausted plea. She had dragged herself here. Garrett could see the trail, a thin smear of blood and grime tracing back across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, disappearing into the darkness beyond the lot's edge. However far she had come, she had done it on 3 legs, and whatever force keeps a body moving when the body has every reason to stop. But it was what he saw beneath her that stopped his breath entirely. Pressed against her belly, tucked into the hollow between her forelegs and her chest, 3 puppies stirred. They were impossibly small, eyes still sealed shut, ears folded flat, bodies no bigger than Garrett's fist. They nuzzled blindly against their mother's underside, searching for warmth, for milk, for the only safety they had ever known. The mother dog hadn't just dragged herself to a stranger's door. She had carried them here, shielded them with the broken architecture of her own body, and hauled them through the cold Nevada night to the first light she could find. Garrett sank to one knee. He didn't touch her. Not yet. He set the flashlight on the step so it pointed away from her eyes and spoke quietly, the way he'd once spoken to a skittish horse on his uncle's ranch, letting the sound of his voice arrive before his hands. "Easy, girl, easy. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Her tail, thin, scarred, trembling, tapped once against the concrete. Just once. But it was enough. Garrett moved slowly. He pulled a clean shop blanket from the shelf inside the door, a grey wool army surplus blanket he normally threw over engines during cold snaps, folded it in half and laid it on the garage floor near the space heater. Then he went back outside, knelt again, and slid his hands beneath the dog's body with the care of a man handling something sacred. She whimpered when he lifted her, a sharp, bitten-off sound, but she didn't snap. The puppies squirmed against her belly as he carried her inside. He set her down on the blanket and studied her under the garage lights. The injuries were worse than he'd first thought. The broken leg was bad, possibly a fractured femur, but the lacerations were what made his stomach tighten. They were deliberate, uniform in their spacing, the kind of marks left not by barbed wire or rough terrain, but by something wielded with intent. Someone had done this to her. He pulled his phone from his back pocket and called Sierra Animal Hospital, a 24-hour emergency clinic off South Virginia Street. It rang 6 times before a woman answered. "Sierra Animal, how can I help you? I've got a dog here that's in bad shape, broken leg, deep cuts all over, and she's got 3 newborn puppies. I need someone to come take a look tonight. We can see her if you bring her in." "What's your location?" "Millbrook Avenue, East Side, the garage at the end." A pause. "The motorcycle club?" "Yeah. Sir, we don't do house calls to that area. You're welcome to bring the animal in during regular hours." "She can't wait until regular hours. She's bleeding. The puppies haven't eaten in God knows how long." "I understand, sir. I can recommend—" He hung up. He tried 2 more numbers. The mobile vet service out of Sparks didn't cover the east side after midnight, liability concerns. The Washoe County Animal Services line rang to a recording that informed him the shelter opened at 8 in the morning. It was 3:17 a.m. The dog on his garage floor was dying by degrees, and the city of Reno had decided that her suffering was an operating hours problem. Garrett sat on the cold concrete beside her and felt something old and familiar settle in his chest. The particular loneliness of being the wrong kind of person in the wrong part of town. He'd been born into it. His father had ridden with the angels before him, and his father's father before that. 3 generations of men that polite society wrote off before they opened their mouths. He picked up the phone and called Dale Pritchard. Dale answered on the second ring, his voice graveled but alert. The vice president of the 300 Angels had the constitution of a man who'd spent 30 years sleeping light, 4 tours with the Marines, then 2 decades on the back of a Harley. "Garrett, what's wrong?" "I need you at the shop. Bring towels and whatever warm milk you've got." "It's 3 in the morning, brother." "I know what time it is, Dale." Dale showed up 14 minutes later in his rusted Ford pickup, wearing jeans pulled over his boxers and a flannel shirt buttoned wrong. He carried a duffel bag containing a quart of goat's milk his wife Karen used for baking, a handful of clean dish towels, a first aid kit meant for humans but better than nothing, and a flashlight that actually held its beam. He stopped short when he saw the dog. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly. He set the duffel down slowly and crouched beside her, his calloused hands that had held rifles and throttle grips, and his wife's face on their wedding day, hovering over the wounds without quite touching. "Who did this to her?" "Don't know yet." Dale looked at the puppies. 3 tiny forms pressed against their mother's belly, wriggling with the blind persistence of creatures who had no concept that the world could be cruel. His jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath his beard, and Garrett saw the older man's eyes go bright and glassy before he blinked it away and cleared his throat. "They're so small," Dale said. They can't even see yet." "No." "And she carried them here, dragged herself with a broken leg and carried them." "Yeah, she did." They worked together for the next hour in near silence, communicating in the shorthand of men who'd spent years reading each other's movements. Garrett cleaned the lacerations as gently as he could manage with warm water and antiseptic from the first aid kit, dabbing at wounds that made the dog flinch and whimper but never bite. Dale fashioned a makeshift splint for the broken leg using 2 wooden dowels and electrical tape. Not ideal, not even close, but enough to stabilize the limb and keep it from shifting. They warmed the goat's milk to body temperature on the shop's hot plate and tried to feed the puppies with an eyedropper Dale had found in Karen's kitchen drawer, squeezing single drops into mouths so tiny they couldn't close around the glass tip. The mother dog watched everything. Her body trembled with pain, but her eyes tracked every hand that came near her offspring. When Dale accidentally bumped one of the puppies, she lifted her head and a low growl vibrated in her throat before subsiding. "She's still protecting them," Dale said, something like awe in his voice. "Even like this." Garrett nodded. He'd already made a decision, and he could see in Dale's face that the older man had arrived at the same place. "We need a vet who'll actually come here," Garrett said. "Or at least one who won't slam the door when they see the vest." Dale scrolled through his phone. "Elena Marsh, independent practice off Plum Lane. Ricky Colvin's neighbor swears by her. Not part of the big chains. Might be willing to make a judgment call. Call her," Dale called. 3 rings. "Dr. Marsh, I'm real sorry to call at this hour. My name is Dale Pritchard, and we've got an emergency. A severely injured dog with 3 newborn puppies, a broken leg, and deep lacerations. She needs help tonight." A pause. Then, "Where are you located?" Dale told her. Another pause, longer, heavy with calculation. Garrett could hear the silence filling with every story Eleanor Marsh had probably heard about the East Side, about the Angels, about men who lived in garages and wore skulls on their backs. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said. "Keep the dog warm and don't try to set the leg yourselves." Dale looked at the wooden dowel splint and winced. "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Elena Marsh arrived at 4:22 a.m. in a white pickup with the tailgate rusted through. She was a small woman in her mid-50s, grey-streaked hair pulled back in a braid, wearing a fleece jacket over wrinkled scrubs. She carried a heavy medical bag in one hand and held her car keys clenched in the other, the jagged end protruding between her fingers like a weapon. Garrett saw it. He always saw it. The quick scan of the environment, the mental noting of exits, the way her body angled slightly toward her truck even as she walked toward the open garage door. He'd watched 1,000 people perform that same silent calculation over the course of his life. The arithmetic of fear. How fast can I get back to my car? What do I do if they block the door? "In here," he said, stepping aside to give her a wide, clear path, keeping his hands visible at his sides. Small gestures that he shouldn't have had to make, but that had become reflex after 4 decades of being someone people feared on sight. Elena entered the garage and her clinical instincts took over within seconds, the professional in her overriding the frightened woman who'd been clutching car keys like a lifeline. She knelt beside the dog, pulled on nitrile gloves from her bag, and began her examination with a focus that pushed everything else to the margins of the room. Her hands moved with the confident precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times, palpating the broken leg, examining the lacerations under the light, pressing a stethoscope to a chest that rose and fell too rapidly. "The femur's fractured, not shattered. That's the one piece of good news," she said without looking up. "The lacerations are infected, at least 3 of them showing early signs of sepsis. She needs antibiotics immediately, IV fluids, pain management, and surgery on that leg within the week if she's going to walk again." She paused, lifted the dog's eyelid, checked the pupil response. Then she added quietly but firmly, "These cuts aren't accidental. The spacing is too regular, the depth too consistent. Somebody did this to her with a tool, a belt buckle, a chain, something with an edge. We figured as much, Garrett said. Eleanor looked at him for the first time since entering. Her gaze moved from his face to the tattoos on his neck, to the club insignia on his vest, to the word president stitched on his back, and returned to his eyes. Whatever judgment she was forming or confirming, she kept it behind her teeth. But Garrett saw the flicker, that momentary hardening of the jaw that said, "I know what kind of man you are." "The puppies are dehydrated but viable," she continued, turning back to her work. 3 days old, maybe 4. She's been nursing them despite everything, but her body has almost nothing left to give. She's severely malnourished, has been for weeks, possibly months. Her body is cannibalizing its own muscle tissue to produce milk. She's keeping them alive at the cost of killing herself. "Can you treat her here tonight?" Dale asked from the doorway. "I can stabilize her, clean the wounds, set the leg in a real splint, start fluids and antibiotics. But the surgery needs to happen at my clinic, under anesthesia, with proper equipment." "How much?" Garrett asked. "All of it. Surgery, post-op, medications, puppy support. $3,000 to $4,000. Could run higher if there are complications. And with the level of infection I'm seeing, complications are likely." The number hung in the air. "Do it." Eleanor studied him. "You understand this is a stray. No owner, no insurance, and there's no guarantee. The leg might not heal correctly. She might not survive the surgery." "I said do it, whatever she needs. We'll cover it." She held his gaze, searching for insincerity or bravado that would evaporate when the bill arrived. She didn't find either. She nodded once and opened her medical bag fully, laying out instruments on a sterile cloth with the efficiency of a field surgeon. For the next 2 hours, Elena worked on the dog with a precision and tenderness that Garrett found himself respecting deeply. The competence of someone who had chosen a difficult, underpaid profession and mastered it because the work mattered to her. She cleaned and sutured the worst lacerations, debrided infected tissue, set the fractured femur in a proper fiberglass splint, inserted an IV catheter for fluids and antibiotics, administered pain medication, and examined each puppy individually with the gentleness of a woman handling something made of glass and breath. While she worked, the phone calls started. Dale had texted the club's group chat at 4 a.m., a single photo of the dog on the blanket with the 3 puppies tucked against her ravaged body. No caption, no explanation, no request. Just the image sent without comment to 300 men. By 5 a.m., replies flooded in from every chapter. Reno, Sparks, Carson City, Sacramento. Men with road names like Anvil and Stitch and Bone Crusher. Men whose faces had appeared in police surveillance files and newspaper crime reports. Men that mothers warned their children about when they passed the compound, all asking the same question. What does she need? Tommy Briggs, a 23-year-old prospect who'd been with the club less than a year, showed up at 6 a.m. with a box of puppy formula and nursing bottles. He'd driven 20 minutes to a 24-hour Walmart to buy, still wearing sweatpants and a sleep-wrinkled t-shirt under his club vest. He stood in the doorway, 6'5", 260 pounds, forearms sleeved in tattoos, a skull ring on every finger of his right hand. And his eyes went red and glassy when he saw the dog. "Who does this to an animal?" he said, and his voice cracked like a teenage boy's, and he didn't try to hide it. Elena looked up from adjusting the IV drip and saw a giant young man with tears running openly into his beard, cradling a box of puppy formula against his broad chest like it was the most important thing he'd ever held. She looked away quickly, but Garrett caught the expression that crossed her face. The brief fracture in her certainty, the first hairline crack in the wall she'd constructed between herself and the men in this room. Something she'd believed without questioning had just bumped against something she was seeing with her own eyes, and the two didn't fit together. By 7 a.m., Mrs. Darnell had called the police. She'd seen trucks arriving in the pre-dawn darkness, lights burning in the garage through the night, unfamiliar men coming and going at all hours. She reported, as she always did, a disturbance involving the motorcycle gang. "I think they might be hurting something in there." 2 officers arrived at 7:15, hands on their duty belts, and found Garrett Whitfield, president of the most feared club in northern Nevada. sitting cross-legged on a garage floor, bottle-feeding a puppy the size of his palm, while a veterinarian sutured wounds on a dying stray. They left without writing a single citation. One of them, a younger officer named Harris, paused at the door on his way out. "You might want to file an animal cruelty report on whatever happened to that dog. Those marks look intentional, and the sooner it's on record, the better." "Already planning on it," Garrett said, without looking up from the puppy in his hands. The video went out at noon. Dale filmed it on his phone. No production, no music, no narration. Just 60 raw seconds in the Millbrook Avenue garage. The mother dog, whom Garrett had started calling Grit, lay on the blanket by the space heater. Her left hind leg was encased in Elena's fiberglass splint. An IV line trailed from her foreleg to a saline bag hung on a coat hook. Her body was a map of sutured wounds, antiseptic stains, and shaved patches. But she was feeding her puppies. Despite the broken leg, despite the fever Elena's thermometer had measured at 104.2 degrees, despite the fact that her body was shutting down, redirecting every calorie into producing milk for 3 blind creatures who knew nothing of the world and knew only her, Grit had shifted onto her good side, arranged her battered body around them, and let them nurse. Dale sent the video to the chapter network, all 4 chapters, all 300 members. The response was something Garrett had never seen in 22 years of leading the club. Within the first hour, the club's emergency fund, a pool normally reserved for bail money, hospital bills when a brother went down on the highway or funeral expenses, had received over $9,000 in direct transfers. Members from the Sacramento chapter sent crates of veterinary supplies, warming pads, and soft blankets. A brother in Fallon who raised cattle on a 100-acre ranch drove 2 hours east through the desert to deliver a cooler packed with fresh raw goat's milk. Phone calls poured in from men who hadn't attended a club meeting in years, men who drifted to the margins of the brotherhood, men who called themselves retired and hadn't worn their vests in a decade. Every one of them said some version of the same thing. "Tell me what to do. Tell me what she needs." 300 men, men who had been called criminals, degenerates, and menaces by newspapers and city councils and neighbors for as long as they could remember, frozen in place by a 60-second video of a broken animal refusing to stop being a mother. Garrett stood in the parking lot that afternoon, fielding calls and trying to organize the flood of offers into something useful, when Eleanor came outside. She'd been at the garage for 12 straight hours now, running on coffee and adrenaline, checking on Grit every 30 minutes. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when they're delivering news they don't want to deliver. Garrett lowered his phone. "I scanned her for a microchip this morning. Standard procedure. She has one." Eleanor paused. "It's registered to a Roger Pennington. Address on Corlin Parkway." Garrett knew the name. Everyone on the east side knew the name. Roger Pennington sat on the Reno City Council, District 3, the wealthy western foothills, and he was the same councilman who had twice led the vote to impose nuisance ordinances targeting the Angels compound on Millbrook Avenue. He was the man who'd stood behind a podium at a public hearing last spring, cameras rolling, and called the East Side a blight that decent families shouldn't have to tolerate. He lived in a 4,000-square-foot house in the Corlin Ranch subdivision with a landscaped yard, a 3-car garage, and a homeowners association that sent fines for crabgrass. "He reported the dog as lost 3 weeks ago," Elena continued, "filed a missing animal report with Animal Services, said she dug under the backyard fence and ran off." "Ran off." Garrett repeated the words slowly, as if testing their weight. They felt hollow. They felt like a lie. "These injuries aren't from running off, Garrett. The lacerations on her shoulders and back are consistent with repeated blunt force trauma and cuts from a sharp-edged instrument, a belt buckle, a chain end, possibly a piece of angle iron. The pattern is too regular for anything accidental. The fracture in her femur is consistent with a direct blow, a kick or a strike, not a fall or a collision. And the malnutrition didn't happen in 3 weeks. This dog has been systematically underfed for months. I can see it in her bone density, in her coat condition, in the state of her teeth." The silence between them filled with something heavy and permanent, like concrete setting. "You're telling me," Garrett said, "that the city councilman who's been trying to shut us down for years, who stood on television and called us a danger to the community, did this to his own dog, and then reported her as lost to cover it up. I'm telling you what the medical evidence shows. I've documented everything thoroughly. Photographs with scale markers, wound measurements, a complete veterinary assessment. What you do with that information is your decision. But if you file a report, what I've gathered will hold up. Garrett looked at her. She was still wearing the same fleece jacket over the same wrinkled scrubs. She hadn't slept in over 16 hours. Her eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with shadows, and her hands, steady, sure, unhesitating, hung at her sides without the car keys clutched between her fingers. Sometime in the last 12 hours, without announcement or ceremony, she had stopped being afraid of him. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. Not an accusation, a genuine question from a man who had learned, through long experience, not to expect help from outside the club. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. A gust of desert wind pushed a scrap of newspaper across the parking lot. "When I drove out here last night," she said, "I expected to find exactly what everyone told me I'd find. Dangerous men doing something I didn't want to know about. I almost didn't come. I sat in my truck for 2 full minutes in my driveway trying to talk myself out of it." She paused, "and instead I found 2 men sitting on a cold floor at 4 in the morning feeding newborn puppies with an eyedropper. I found a kid crying over a box of formula. I found people who cared more about a stray dog than anyone else in this entire city was willing to." She looked at the garage, at the motorcycles, at the winged skull insignia painted on the rolling door. "I was wrong about this place. I'd rather admit that than keep pretending." Garrett nodded slowly. He pulled out his phone and called Officer Harris. The investigation moved quickly after that. Harris and a detective from the Animal Cruelty Unit visited Pennington's property on Corlin Parkway the following day, armed with Eleanor's documentation and a warrant. They found a backyard kennel with a chain-link enclosure, no bedding, no water bowl, the concrete floor stained dark with old blood. A neighbor 2 houses down, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that she'd heard the dog crying and yelping for months, but had never reported it. Pennington was on the city council after all. He had influence. He sat on the HOA board. He had a reputation. A reputation. Garrett thought about that word and how it worked, how it functioned like a lock on a door, keeping things in or keeping things out, depending on which side you stood. Pennington's reputation had kept his neighbors silent while an animal suffered behind his manicured fence. Garrett's reputation had kept 3 veterinary services from answering his call at 3 in the morning. 2 different locks, same mechanism, different doors. And behind both of them, someone was suffering. Charges were filed: felony animal cruelty under Nevada Revised Statute 574.100. Pennington denied everything. His lawyer issued a statement calling the accusation politically motivated harassment by a known criminal organization. The Reno Gazette-Journal ran the story on the front page, and for the first time in the 300 Angels history, the photograph that accompanied the article wasn't a mugshot or a surveillance image. It was Tommy Briggs, tears on his face, holding a puppy the size of a peach in his enormous hands. Grit's surgery happened on a Friday, 5 days after she dragged herself to Garrett's door. Eleanor performed the procedure at her clinic, a femoral repair with an intramedullary pin, followed by wound debridement on the deepest lacerations. The surgery took 3 hours. Garrett and Dale sat in the waiting room the entire time, their boots leaving mud prints on clean tile, their vests drawing stares from the other pet owners. The woman with the cat carrier moved to a seat farther away. The man with the poodle looked at Garrett and said, "You're the guys who saved that dog, aren't you? I saw it on the news." Garrett nodded. "That's a hell of a thing you did," the man said. He didn't move away. Grit survived. She spent a week recovering at Elena's clinic, and during that week something shifted in the geography of Millbrook Avenue, something quiet and tectonic. It started small. A card on the garage door, no signature, just "Thank you for helping her" in neat handwriting. A bag of dog food on the step. A woman from 3 blocks over, who'd walked past for 12 years without acknowledging Garrett's existence, stopped her car and asked how the puppies were doing. Then Mrs. Darnell came over. She stood on the parking lot in her housecoat and orthopedic shoes, arms crossed, chin lifted with the particular defiance of a woman who had never admitted to being wrong about anything. Garrett came outside expecting another complaint. "I saw the news," she said, "about the councilman." "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a long time. A crow called from the power line. The October wind carried the smell of sagebrush. "I've lived next door for 9 years. And I've called the police on you people. I don't know how many times." 11, Garrett said. "But who's counting?" Something almost like a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I was scared. All those motorcycles, all that noise, all those men who looked like... Well, I was scared." "I know you were, Mrs. Darnell." "That dog came to your door," she said, her voice thinner now, stripped of armor. "Out of every door on this street, every house in this neighborhood, she came to yours." She paused. Maybe she knew something I didn't. Garrett didn't say anything. There was nothing to add that the moment didn't already hold. Mrs. Darnell produced a Tupperware container from her pocket. "Banana bread, still warm. Don't read too much into it." She turned and walked back to her house, and Garrett stood holding warm banana bread and feeling something unlock inside his chest that had been bolted shut for a very long time, and he had to look up at the sky because his eyes were stinging, and there was no one around he needed to explain that to. Grit came home to the garage on a Tuesday. She walked through the door on 3 legs and a surgical pin and went straight to the blanket by the space heater, lowered herself with a grunt, and closed her eyes, as if she'd always lived there. The puppies, now 2 weeks old, had their eyes open. They tumbled over each other in a cardboard box lined with towels, making sounds that were not quite barks and not quite anything else. Garrett named them. The biggest, a brindle female with her mother's amber eyes, was Piston. The middle one, a black and white male who never stopped moving, was Throttle. The runt, small and quiet and determined, was Spoke. The 300 angels voted unanimously, all 4 chapters, all 300 members, to establish the Grit Foundation, partnering with local shelters and veterinary clinics to fund emergency care for abused animals. Eleanor agreed to serve as medical director. The club's first fundraiser, a charity ride from Reno to Virginia City, raised $22,000. Riders came from as far as Portland and Phoenix. Some weren't bikers at all. They were teachers and nurses who'd seen the news and wanted to be part of something good. The Gazette-Journal ran a follow-up, 300 Angels Find Their Mission. The photograph was Grit in a patch of October sunlight, 3 puppies sprawled across her side, Garrett's hand resting on her scarred head. Roger Pennington's case went to trial 4 months later. Eleanor's documentation, 63 photographs, a 12-page veterinary assessment, proved decisive. The neighbor who'd heard the dog crying testified on the record, weeping as she described months of sounds she'd chosen not to investigate. Pennington was convicted on 2 counts of felony animal cruelty and sentenced to 18 months of probation, a $10,000 fine, and a lifetime ban on animal ownership. He resigned from the council. His house sold 3 months later. The new owners adopted a rescue dog their first week. Garrett kept Grit. There was never any question. She slept in the garage on the blanket by the space heater, and when he worked late on engines, she lay beside the toolbox and watched him with those amber eyes that had seen the worst of what people could do and had still chosen to drag a broken body toward the light coming from under a stranger's door. Piston went home with Dale and Karen. Throttle went to Tommy, who posted daily photos and cried about it weekly. Spoke, the runt, went to Eleanor Marsh, who had driven to a biker's garage expecting monsters and found something that rearranged every assumption she'd carried. On a Sunday evening in late November, Garrett sat in the open doorway of his garage, coffee in hand, Grit at his feet. The Nevada sky bled out in bands of copper and violet over the Sierras. Motorcycles lined the lot for the weekly gathering. Inside, Dale was telling a story that made Tommy laugh so hard he choked on his beer. Mrs. Darnell's kitchen light was on across the fence. She'd started leaving her porch light on, not to watch the angels, but because the street looked safer with more light. She brought banana bread every Sunday now, and Garrett had stopped pretending he didn't look forward to it. He scratched behind Grit's ear. She leaned into his hand, her tail sweeping a slow arc across the concrete. She limped, would always limp, but she moved through the world with the steady gait of a creature that had decided against all evidence that the world was worth walking through. That was the thing about walls, Garrett thought. The ones between people and the ones between what you were and what people decided you were. They all looked permanent until something came along and scratched at the door. Something wounded and stubborn and impossible to ignore. And then you had a choice. Leave the door closed and pretend you didn't hear it, or open it and let the whole architecture of your assumptions come undone. Grit had chosen his door. Out of every door on every street, in a city full of respectable houses and comfortable people, she had dragged her broken body and her 3 helpless puppies to a biker's garage at 3 in the morning. And the man who opened that door, the man every neighbor feared, every council member disparaged, every stranger avoided, was the only one who answered. The sunset faded. The stars came out over Millbrook Avenue. Laughter drifted from inside the garage, and Grit closed her eyes. And Garrett Whitfield, president of the 300 Angels, felon by reputation, monster by assumption, angel by action, sat in the doorway of his home and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he had nothing left to prove.